Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and today I'm going to be talking about the medieval astrology of coronavirus. And this is in line with the other part of my work. My main job is a medical herbalist, so I did a science degree. I kind of use evidence-based medicine with that alongside the tradition of using plants. But my other job is I moonlight as an astrologer, as a classical astrologer, and obviously there is very little scientific support for astrology. There is a bit, and I'll put a link to Robert Curry's fantastic website below where he details some of the extant scientific research into astrology, but there's not much, and there are various reasons for that which I won't go into. But astrology was used historically, was used for thousands of years, at least 3,000 years, and it was used as a very important component of medicine prior to the Enlightenment. Of course, nowadays using divination with medicine is considered to be beyond the pale, but I do think it is useful. And I think it's useful on the level of contextualizing illness, but I think it also has predictive use. The big reason I think why it hasn't been proven is that most of the tests fail to take into account the nature of all divination. And in fact all magical processes, which are, to my mind, entirely context dependent. In other words, something like astrology, while it reads like a science, which has led to some people sort of slandering it, saying it's a pseudo-science, which is sort of a way of saying that it looks scientific but isn't. Well, I would agree it looks scientific but isn't, in the reductive sense that modern science is. It's mechanistic. It requires a material physical cause. The philosophy that astrology comes from assumes that the universe is a product of consciousness, and all of it is conscious and all of it is constantly interconnected, and every part of the universe is governed by some form of unitary consciousness, and all of it is constantly interconnected even when there is no physical or material cause. So I think the reason astrology hasn't been proven is because to date there are no longitudinal, that is long-term studies of astrological prediction over time in real life. There are lots of little studies of astrology in the lab which have either sort of turned up chance results or slightly better than chance, but not much. But none of the actual sort that really matter, which is studying astrological prediction objectively in terms of how accurate those predictions are, and subjectively in real life, in real people, over a long period of time. That means over decades, to my mind. And also historically, there have been some astrologers, very famous astrologers, who've done extremely well, who have consistently predicted important events, and others, perhaps the majority, who aren't so good at it. Because let me tell you, as an astrologer, it's hella complicated. So anyway, those are some of my little thoughts. I could, this is a whole video in and of itself about the proof and disproof of astrology, the philosophies that underlie it, and these are subjects to which I will return later. But in this video, I just want to get into the astrology of coronavirus. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that the techniques that I'm going to be using were those employed by, as the title would imply, medieval astrologers, but also the astrologers of Renaissance Europe. Principally as a medical astrologer, I focus on personal predictions of how medical events will fall out, and more importantly than that, personal analyses, like helping people make sense of their illness using astrology as a framework. And the way that I incorporate that into my personal practice is it's a Venn diagram kind of job. On the one hand, I have my evidence-based medicine sort of, I don't want to say rational, because to my astrology is rational also, but evidence-based and objective or mechanistic thinking. So I go through a conventional diagnostic procedure. I'll recommend herbs on the basis of their tradition and of their pharmacology. But then, so that's one half, one circle of the diagram, and then the other circle is the astrological or esoteric information, and I will prescribe and advise and recommend on what is the overlap so it can't just be from the astrological information. I can't just have an astrological prognosis, and I can't just have a biomedical diagnosis and prognosis. It has to be what lies in the middle. So the worst that could happen, if you think astrology is a load of old bunk, in my practice is that I might be excluding possibilities on the basis of astrology, but what I'm not doing is only prescribing on the basis of either astrology and tradition or on the basis of purely pharmacological or sort of materialistic logic, if that makes any sense. So that's a bit about my approach and how I incorporate this sort of very ancient and rather, I guess, not unusual, but it's kind of out of step with modern thinking. I incorporate that framework into my practice. But in terms of the historical use of astrology, particularly in epidemics, there's a very, very long history of that. So I'm just going to refer to a very famous, one of the big sort of famous pandemics of history was, of course, the Black Death. And there were many recurrent instances of plague. There was the plague of Justinian in the late Roman times. There was the Black Death was the big one. These are all instances of bubonic plague. And then there was a later outbreaks of plague in Europe as well. But the big one was the sort of bubonic plague, which more than decimated the population of Europe. To decimate means to kill 1 in 10 people. The Black Death in Europe killed approximately 50% of the population. Crazy, 1 in 2 people. And astrologers at the time, in the Middle Ages, at the University of Paris, the King of France, King Philip VI, asked astrologers at the University of Paris, why did this happen? Because, of course, a lot of astrologers failed to predict this. This is a charge that's often levelled at astrologers. If you're so good, why did you not predict it? Well, I refer you to my earlier context-dependent thing. A lot of the time, astrologers do say something bad is going to happen here, and it could be this or it could be that. But, for example, this year, it may interest you to know, many astrologers have been saying for the past 3 or 4 years, on the basis of 2, 3 or 4 astronomical events, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the end of this year, and the Jupiter-Mars conjunction being 3 of the major, what's the word? 3 of the major things this year. I can't remember, my brain has gone today, but 3 of the major configurations, that's it, this year. Astrologers have been saying that this year is a major year and that it's going to be a pivotal and difficult year. Pivotal year for culture as a whole and a difficult year. And again, I will link some blogs below. As usual in this video, I'm going to show my working throughout. I'm going to tell you what my reasoning is for any of these conclusions and conjectures that I'll be presenting. And I'm going to put the links to any relevant works or references in the description box on YouTube below this video. If you have, say, a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, the so-called great conjunctions in traditional astrology, of the sort which happen every 20 years and of the kind which is happening at the end of 2020, there are certain rules traditionally. So, for example, if that conjunction occurred in a sign ruled by one of the more challenging planets in traditional astrology, so a sign ruled by Saturn or Mars, which of course well, not of course, many of you won't be astrologers, but that the one coming up at the end of this year, at the end of 2020, is occurring in Aquarius, which is traditionally ruled by Saturn. So if it was in a sign ruled by one of those more traditional, difficult planets, then it would be said to be, perhaps generally speaking, more challenging and productive of more challenging events. And then you might look at the chart, that is to say a map of the sky. The astrological chart is just a map of the sky for a particular location to determine what the kind of events might be. And of course that will give you some idea, but let's say that conjunction was happening in the 10th house, that's the middle of the sky, in a particular location, and that it was, well, let's just leave it at that. Let's say it's a conjunction happening in a Saturn-ruled sign in the 10th house, and then you have all these other things that you'd add onto it. The 10th house, the middle of the sky, being the point right up above, was considered to represent leaders and kings and people in positions of power and authority, because it was the middle of the sky. So it might be suspected that that conjunction would say something about what would be happening to kings and leaders and whatnot, and because it would be happening in a sign ruled by a difficult planet like Saturn, then those things might not be good. But there are a bunch of other factors in the chart that would tell you what sort of things could be happening. Even when you've done all that working out, without sufficient context, it's very difficult to know. So for example, if you were working 400 years in the future, you could do some perfect astrology and still not know what was happening. So if you couldn't imagine the existence of aeroplanes, radios, and many of the technologies of the modern world, an astrologer predicting 400 years into the future in the Middle Ages might have made some educated guesses, which in the context of the culture of the time would have made sense, but wouldn't read so well now. Do you see what I mean? And so even with more information than that, to give you a more tangible example, a more small-scale example, I remember many years ago, someone very close to me lost their engagement ring, a very expensive diamond engagement ring, and I did what's called a horary chart. That's answering a question, where is my ring? And the chart indicated that the ring had been dropped on the floor and probably in some place associated with animals, and then had been picked up by a servant and taken to a place where rubbish is kept, and that this person may be able to collect the ring later. So asking them about what had happened, it turned out that well, this person worked with horses, and that the ring, so we thought, dropped in a place working with animals. It might have been when they were sort of sweeping out their stables, and then there were people working on the farm who were employees of this person, and they routinely collected all the muck from the stables and took it up to a muck heap. So I said, well, maybe one of these servants has collected all the muck up from the ring that's dropped on the floor in the place where all the animals were, and it's been taken to the muck heap, and you might want to go and look through the muck heap. Well, fortunately, this person ignored all my advice and didn't go looking through it. Probably they didn't fancy putting their hands in loads of horse poo. The ring turned up about 3 months later. What had happened was that they'd gone to a nearby, near their place of work, there's a sort of a farm store where lots of animal sort of husbandry equipment was kept, and it turned out that they dropped it. It had been found on the floor by one of the shop girls in the, because it's a big, huge, big sort of barn place where loads of animal feed was kept. One of the shop girls had found it and put it in the lost property cupboard, and it picked it up. So the chart was correct in every particular, but the astrological prediction was wrong in every particular, in the specific sense. So if that was being assessed scientifically, it would have been like 100% wrong, but the astrology and the essentials of the prediction were 100% right. So this is the big issue. You're talking about a symbolic plasticity and the many different ways things can happen. Anyway, just to give you an example of what I mean when I say things can manifest in different ways, and it's all very context dependent. And even when your prediction is correct, it can still appear to be wrong in the specifics. So the use of astrology, I find, is more in the analysis of the why. Particularly, it is useful to my mind for prediction in terms of as Deborah Holding, famous and very good astrologer, says, it's useful to know when you need to bring an umbrella. You know, it's useful for that kind of thing. The weather report, what sort of thing may happen, and very often if you have a specific situation, it can help with that. So, long preamble over with. Let's get into the astrology. So this astrology of the Black Death in the Middle Ages. King Philip of France asked the astrologers at the University of Paris to explain what had happened, and they used one of these two big important traditional techniques. They used the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn the two slowest moving of the visible planets. That means visible to the naked eye. Of course, they didn't know in the Middle Ages about Uranus, Neptune, Pluto and all the other objects further out because they couldn't see them. So the planets that were symbolically relevant were the ones you could see also, because they couldn't see the others for a start. But so they used to use the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, which occur every 20 years, as very important for culture and sort of changes in society as a whole. So they would look not at the chart for that conjunction specifically, but usually at the chart of an eclipse happening close to that conjunction, because the reason for that was Jupiter and Saturn, slow-moving planets, were taken to symbolise broader movements of culture. Saturn was the symbol of everything reductive and restrictive and physical or concrete. The reason for that combination of symbolism is, of course, when you make something material or physical, it automatically becomes finite. In other words, anything physical has a lifespan. So Saturn was simultaneously the symbol of mortality and described as the great malefic, because of course time results in the death or destruction of everything, but was also the most important of the planets in many ways to the material world. And Jupiter, the other big culture-making planet, was the great benefic, because Jupiter symbolized faith and expansion and joy and growth. So Saturn was sort of negative and Jupiter was the positive, but Saturn enabled the physical to manifest and Jupiter enabled the beliefs and faiths and changes in philosophy. So you put those two together and you've got the culture builders. But they're both very abstract symbols. So they would use eclipses, because eclipses, of course, are produced by what's known astronomically as the Saros cycle, the repetitious, cyclical, recurrent sort of dance of the luminaries, the sun and the moon, their movements, their conjunctions in the sky and whatnot. So the moon and sun obviously were faster moving bodies in terms of from our perspective on Earth. Of course, we now know that the sun does not go round the Earth, we go round the sun, but from a geocentric perspective, from the perspective of us on Earth, it looks like we go round the sun, or the sun goes round us once every year rather, and the moon goes round us rather faster, once every month, or 29 days approximately. So these two, the movement of those two, we use to bring the prediction more down to Earth, if you like. So I'll show you a chart that they would have put up, that they produced for the Black Death, which was this eclipse in 1345, and this chart, which I've got up on the screen now, I'm showing you the square chart format, which was the format that they used in the Middle Ages. But I'll put, for any astrologers, I'll put up the round chart version, which is a bit easier to read if you're familiar with astrology. So anyway, I'm just glancing at my chart here. In this chart, the important bits of the chart are the ascendant, which is the eastern horizon, which I'll highlight, which in this chart is Scorpio, and the sixth house, which is the house of illness. And the important thing in this chart for this eclipse is that they're both ruled by the same planet, which immediately ties the eastern horizon was taken to symbolize the people of the country, and the sixth house was taken to symbolize disease. So when you have the same planet ruling two houses, it automatically ties those things together. So the people of the country and disease are tied together. Scorpio traditionally was a very difficult sign, interestingly associated with vermin, such as rodents, rats and fleas. So of course we now know that the plague was caused by rats and fleas, but they didn't know that then. So what we've got, the important thing here, is that this eclipse is happening just before the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, back in 1345. And at this time, what's really important is we have Jupiter, Saturn and Mars all lined up in Aquarius, which, as I say, is a Saturn-ruled sign and therefore difficult. And this was a nighttime chart. Saturn was traditionally a cold and dry planet, and as I say, was the great malefic. It was taken to symbolize difficult conditions, and its nature was cold and dry. So it was supposed to be worse symbolically in the night time. So it indicated very difficult conditions. So I'm not going to go into this chart in detail right now, but the point about this was we have a pile-up of Jupiter, Mars and Saturn. Mars and Saturn were the two difficult planets in Aquarius, which was traditionally a hot, moist air sign. So it was said traditionally that air signs were prone to corruption of the blood, diseases of the blood, and because this conjunction was happening in a Saturn-ruled sign, it would produce more difficult conditions. The ruler of the ascendant, the people, and the ruler of the house of disease were the same, was Mars, and Mars was linked to this conjunction, and the combination of Mars and Saturn in any sign is always difficult. So just from that alone, you have this eclipse being linked to the possibility of disease affecting the population, and that disease being linked to corruption of the blood, if you like. So fevers, inflammations, infectious diseases, and that kind of thing. There's more to be said about eclipses and this chart indeed, and they used other charts with it, but I don't want to get too far into that. I just wanted to highlight this eclipse using technique, and the idea here was that they would link an eclipse to either a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, or to one of the solstice points, the points where the sun was entering the tropical signs of Aries, Cancer, Libra or Capricorn. And by the way, Western astrologers like myself and those of the West in the Middle Ages and the medieval Arabic astrologers and the ancient Greek astrologers even all use what's known as the tropical zodiac, which is named after the 12 principal constellations that are on the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. In other words, if the sun and the Earth were on a tabletop, ignoring the fact that the sun is about 12,000 times bigger than the Earth, and it was massive and they wouldn't both fit on the same tabletop. But the point is, if they're on a tabletop, it's the constellations that are visible around the edges of that table, barring Ophiuchus, which we won't get into. But anyway, the point is those 12 constellations, the signs are named after them, but first of all, those constellations are not all the same size, but secondly, they don't line up with the zodiac names. Our traditional Western zodiac is actually pinned to the solar year, so that when we arrive at the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, or what would be the autumn equinox in the southern hemisphere, it's always the sun is at 0 Aries. And when we arrive at the summer equinox in the northern hemisphere, or the winter equinox in the southern hemisphere, the sun is always at 0 Cancer, and so on. So astrologers are well aware that the zodiac signs don't match up with the constellations. We do use the actual positions of the stars, but our division of the sky into 12 equal segments is actually a division of the solar year, and is symbolically divided and named after the constellations, but isn't contiguous with them. And we do know about that. Anyway, right, so I've talked a little bit about that. Coronavirus. Whoa, sorry about the wobble. Finally, okay. So I'm basing the first bit of this video on, in terms of me talking about corona, on some astrology I did for the Academy of Astrology, which I work for and teach at. I'll put a link to that website below. And I did this when the things were going a bit mental in China back in February 2020. Because we have a lot of students in China. The Academy of Astrology has several schools in China and in Taiwan and in Asia in general. So I wanted to do some astrology to maybe reassure isn't the right word, but to inform students there, and so they could look at the astro and just, put their brains on it. So I did a bit of a retrospective looking at Wuhan, the charts for Wuhan, where obviously it started, and I looked at the charts of the autumn solstice, what's called the Libra Ingress, and the chart of the winter solstice. But the most pertinent chart for the global epidemic or pandemic that we're now experiencing, I felt in retrospect, and the chart which enabled a certain degree of prediction, was the eclipse chart just following, I think, if I look at my notes, I'll pop it on the screen, the eclipse chart just following the winter solstice, that's to say the Capricorn ingress, the entry of the sun into Capricorn. So I'll highlight that for any non-astrologers, I'll circle the bit on the chart. You've got this conjunction of the sun and the moon at 4 degrees of Capricorn. And that isn't just a conjunction, it's happening near this little symbol, this little U-shaped thing, which means the south node, which is one of the eclipse points. And it's happening, this pile up of planets, we've got the moon, the sun, Jupiter and the south node piling up in a full-on solar eclipse in this part of the chart, which is the 9th house. That is the place in the chart which relates to long distance travel, philosophy and higher education, and also overseas in general, foreigners in general. There are 2 places in the chart that really represent foreigners. One is the 7th house, the house of other people, which is the western horizon, but the other is the 9th house, which is overseas. So we can already tell from this eclipse chart that it has relevance to people overseas and foreigners. We've also got, this is the eclipse for Wuhan, remember. So we've got the ascendant has Aries on it, and Aries is ruled by Mars, which I'm going to circle now, which is in Scorpio. Again, this rather difficult sign traditionally. And Scorpio, the other sign that Mars rules, is on the cusp of the 8th house, which I'll circle also. And the 8th house represents death. So you already have a connection between the people of Wuhan and death or suffering. And because the chart is ruled by Mars, and it's a chart in the daytime, because of course the sun is in the sky, Mars is a more difficult planet in the daytime, just as Saturn is worse at night. Saturn is too cold and dry. It's the naughty planet that's excessively cold and dark, so it does better when it's warmed up in the daytime. This is the symbolism, the symbolic language of astrology. Mars traditionally represents hot, dry conditions. It's better at night when it's cooled down. During the day it becomes more problematic, more malefic traditionally. So you already have a link potentially between the people of Wuhan and death. Now the 8th house has other meanings too. It can mean other people's money. So if Mars is behaving well, and if the chart is behaving well, it could mean this indicates a good time for earning money from other people. Doesn't indicate that, but I'll get into the why now. The eclipse is occurring in Capricorn. Eclipse charts always represent some kind of disruption, because of course the light of either the sun or the moon is temporarily shut off. So I kind of consider eclipses as being like when your computer crashes or just shuts down and then it restarts. And if it happens on the north node, that's one of the eclipse points. It's like when the computer turns on again, there's something new on it. And whether that new thing is it's sort of rebooted itself and a load of bugs that you've had on it for ages suddenly work. You sort of switch it off and switch it on again, or it shuts down and restarts and everything's working great. It's like it's got something new on it, like it's better functioning than it was before, or whether it's downloaded a virus really depends on the nature of the whole chart. This eclipse is happening, the Wuhan eclipse from 2019, from the end of 2019, is happening on the south node. And the south node is a place of exit or taking something away. So it's like your computer shuts down and restarts and something's gone, something's missing from it. And again, what could be missing might be a load of corrupted files that were messing up your computer, or it might be a load of work that you've been spending ages working on and you really wish was still there. So, it really depends what's going on. Well, this eclipse is ruled by Saturn, one of the traditionally naughty planets. And this is what Ptolemy, one of our ancient authorities on eclipses, who wrote his book Tetrabiblos around, I think, the 3rd century, I'll put it on the screen, 3rd century AD, I think. This is what Ptolemy had to say about eclipses, solar eclipses, I think any eclipses ruled by Saturn. The nature of the events are described by Saturn, lord of the eclipse, who represents lingering diseases, griefs, alarms and deaths, chiefly among persons advanced in age, as well as harm to animals serviceable to man. And because the sign is Capricorn, those might be animals symbolised by Capricorn, such as goats, reptiles, fishes, birds and other wildlife. And that's interesting given that the epidemic is now considered to have started in the wet market in Wuhan, and it may have come from pangolins, which are sort of scaled animals, which are very much of the sort of Capricorn type. Anyway, the fact that this is happening in the 9th house, remember it's a Saturn ruled eclipse, so it's problems, all those planets are in the 9th, and also Jupiter in this chart, the good planet, the planet of expansion and travel and philosophy and faith, is very weak in the 9th house. It's in a Capricorn, Jupiter is considered to be in its fall, which is a weak position. It's also very close to the sun, which is combust. It means it's burned up. And Jupiter in this chart rules, using astrological symbolic rules, it rules the, I think, 12th and 9th houses. The 12th house has a bunch of less good meanings, but also means hospitals and charity and welfare, and the 9th house is the house of travel. So whatever this eclipse is going to do, it's going to mess up hospitals and it's going to mess up long distance travel. 9th house, 12th house. So we know that for a start. So this is what I wrote all this down. So this is my brief interpretation of the chart. So the eclipse, the nature of the events described by Saturn, which I've just talked about. Jupiter ruling the 9th and 12th houses with the south node in the 9th house. Foreign travel will become very difficult and many hospitals overseas will be overwhelmed. The virus will cause much confusion and medical miscommunication. This is because we have the ruler of the 6th house of disease, Mercury in this chart, in the 9th. So that's the disease going overseas. But the one good bit about this chart, the one good thing is that Mercury is in Sagittarius, which is the sign of its detriment, which implies that the disease will get weaker over time, because planets in detriment, while not necessarily weak, do tend to fall apart as time goes on. Also, Sagittarius was considered traditionally to be a mutable and double-bodied sign. So what that implies is that the virus should mutate and more than one variety will emerge as it spreads overseas and in the process become weaker. Another testimony for this is that Saturn is occidental, which means it rose after the sun. Ptolemy says of that will tend to mean the effects of the eclipse get weaker over time. So if it was a good eclipse, it means it starts off good and then gets less good over time. Because this is a bad eclipse, it means those effects which come from it will get weaker over time. But how long? What time frame are we talking about? Well, Ptolemy worked this out for us too. He said that if an eclipse happens near the eastern horizon, the effects can be expected pretty much immediately or within the first 4 months. If it happens near the middle of the sky, the effects can be expected within sort of 6 to 8 months. And if it happens on the western horizon, sort of nearly sunset, it'll be more like 12 months to a year away. That's when the main effects kick in. And then the real clincher is how long after that may the effects last. And his recommendation was that the length of time one might expect the effects to last is equivalent to how many clock hours that eclipse lasts. I don't think he meant clock hours though, because Dr. Benjamin Dykes, who translated loads of fantastic books, he's done amazing translation work. In his translation it says equinoctial hours, but which means clock hours, clock time. So in that case, Ptolemy would have said 1 hour of clock time equals 1 year in terms of the eclipse duration. But in my other translation by Ashmand, in an other translation I've got, it says equatorial hours, which are very different. Equatorial hours are, say the Earth, obviously the equator, the 360-degree circle, imaginary circle around the middle of the Earth. The equator, we know the Earth rotates once every 24 hours. So it rotates. An equatorial hour is how long it takes the Earth to rotate 15 degrees. Because if a circle is 360 degrees and the Earth rotates 360 degrees in 1 hour, 360 divided by 24 hours equals 15 degrees. So an equatorial hour is how long it takes the Earth to rotate 15 degrees. In astronomical terms, it's how long does it take the Earth to move past 15 degrees of what's called right ascension, which is just the degrees of the equator, basically. So, sorry, camera wobbles. So what we're looking at there is two different potential timings, but I'm going to go for the equatorial hours because this fits with other traditional timing techniques a bit better than just using the clock hours. So if we look at it in terms, and it doesn't make that much difference to be honest, but if we look at the equatorial hours, then the eclipse lasted in clock time 3 hours and 26 minutes. In that time, the Earth moved approximately how much? Blah, blah, blah. It equated to 3.44 equatorial hours. So that would be 3 years and 5 months symbolically. So, and because Ptolemy said this eclipse in this eclipse chart occurs in the 9th house, just past the midheaven, I'm going to say that's approximately 8 months in terms of when the major effects of the eclipse will begin. So this eclipse occurred at the end of 2019, in December 2019. The major effects will kick in around 8 months from then, which would be in June, July. Was it 8 months or no, 6 or 7 months? So it'll occur, the major effects I worked out occur in June, July 2020, sorry. June, July 2020. So we've got December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. So that's around 7 months because Ptolemy said if it happens on the eastern horizon, it's around now to 4 months. If it's around the midheaven, it's around 6 to 8 months. So because it's just past the midheaven, I'm going to say around 7 months, which would be June, July this year would be when the effects really kick in internationally. And then from that point, we can expect the effects of this eclipse to linger for another 3 years and 5 months, which would mean until November to December 2023. Now, the peak effect, he also said, would also correspond to that relative position in the 9th house. So the peak effect would then be around just past the halfway point of that. So if we take 3 years and 5 months from June, July 2020 and look at about sort of just past halfway to 2/3 of the way through that, we're looking at around April to August 2022. And I think that fits with certain other astronomical indications. For any of you astrologers out there, that would be when Saturn stations retrograde at 25 Aquarius, which you can see aspects, squares the Mars in the eclipse chart. And also the nodes, the eclipse points are at 20 Taurus and Scorpio, picking up that Saturn and the Mars. So that happens around April to August 2022. So that might be peak effects. Practically speaking, what that means is that internationally, because this chart has its major effects in the 9th house, that's where the eclipse is taking place, the ramifications of this disease-related eclipse or this difficult problems related eclipse will start really begin or be fully manifest by June, July 2020 and may carry on for another 3 and a bit years and will be at their maximal in April to August 2022. That doesn't mean, for anyone who's despairing at this point, that the coronavirus itself will carry on unmitigated throughout that time. It just means the reverberations, the effects, the consequences will manifest over that period of time, and that the most important consequences will manifest maybe most severely around April to August 2022. So that's interesting. And of course, it's going to vary from country to country. This chart is the chart of Wuhan. Reasons not to despair. As I've said, this chart does suggest that the illness will mutate and get weaker over time. It also suggests, because Saturn itself is pretty strong in the 10th house, and it's a daytime chart, so Saturn isn't quite so bad, it also suggests that governments will deal with this pretty well, and they'll deal with this well through Saturnian means, which is shutting things down, tightening up borders, imposing restrictions, that kind of thing. So quarantine and strict measures, and they will help to contain the problem and ultimately get it under wraps because of that. The second thing is that this chart also has a fixed star called Vega on the midheaven in the middle of the sky. You can't see it on the chart, but Vega's around 15 degrees of Capricorn. And that star, traditionally called the falling vulture, is a fortunate star. It's symbolized by the planets Venus and Mercury. And that would imply that there'd be some help from medicine and from government. And it may also suggest a fall from grace of people who are corrupt. So some of the long-term effects of this eclipse, while it will entail governments becoming more restrictive and oppressive and necessarily controlling, ultimately may result in a purging of corruption from the ranks of government, which would be very fitting for the south node, the outgoing nature of this eclipse. And another thing, the fortunate star Spica is on the descendant, on the western horizon. Spica is around 23-24 degrees Libra, and that star is very, very fortunate. So it means the 7th house is the house of foreigners. So obviously this is the eclipse for Wuhan. That means people overseas will largely, despite the problems that this chart indicates for foreigners, will largely be protected. So that's kind of helpful. And the last thing is that the lunar mansion, which is the place where the moon is, traditionally it's in the 22nd tropical lunar mansion. What that means is a division of the zodiac circle into, I can't remember how many, but a number of different mansions. I should know this, but I'll put it on the screen. And the it's in the 22nd tropical lunar mansion, which is called the fortune of the sacrificer. And its traditional meanings, I kid you not, mean liberation, cure of illnesses, and captives escape. So it's the escape from captivity, it's curing of illnesses. But it does that, it's a difficult mansion. It's called the fortune of the sacrificer. In other words, gains to be had through sacrifices being made. So that's the main astrological descriptor of this epidemic, I would say. Right, so there's a lot more I could say about this eclipse chart, and there are a lot of other charts of the astrology of the world that I could look at in relation to the coronavirus, but I thought this eclipse chart for Wuhan in December 2019 was the most relevant, and I don't want this video to last 10 hours, so I'm going to move on. So that was an eclipse chart close to the one of the ingresses, which is to say one of the solstice points, the winter solstice, which is a very traditional technique for looking at astrology on a world stage. That's mundane astrology traditionally. So I'm going to go from that top tier of astrology to the bottom rung, which is called horary astrology. And this is astrology of answering specific personal questions. Now, I've got into trouble in the past with other astrologers for using this kind of astrology to answer questions which have a broad application, like as in that apply on a national level, because horary astrology is very simply asking a question, and the chart is the chart of the time and place that the question is asked. So it's very personal, but it's very specific. The idea is that when a thought occurs to you, when an urgent question occurs to you, it occurs to you at that time, not by chance. In astrological terms, in traditional magical thinking, nothing is coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidence. So when something occurs to you, if it's an urgent and pressing question, then that question has its own birth time, if you like. It's brought into your mind at that time for a reason, if you like. So there are some astrologers who don't like individual people asking questions about large-scale events, because they say, well, hypothetically, 20 people could ask that question, each have different charts and produce different answers. I see that objection, but I have two answers to that. The first would be an argument from history. Some of the greatest astrologers in history, such as Bonatti, the I think 11th century, very famous astrologer, who was the astrologer of the venerable and somewhat controversial Medici family in Italy. Apparently Dante confined him to one of the circles of hell in his Inferno for his work for the Medicis and his work as an astrologer. But anyway, very, very famous, eminent and talented astrologer. He used to use questions for such things as deciding when to fight battles, what the outcome of particular campaigns would be, etc. And likewise, William Lilly, the famous 16th, 17th century English horary astrologer, who was on the side of the parliamentarians in the English Civil War, used to do large-scale horary questions on the outcome of battles and the fate of monarchs and countries and whatnot. So there's a historical precedent. That's number one. Number two would be, it's entirely possible for a few different astrologers to ask different charts if those questions are radical, meaning they have roots, meaning the charts are valid charts. There were several different techniques used in traditional astrology called considerations before judgment that astrologers can use to determine whether a horary chart, whether a question chart is appropriate, whether the question is appropriate. If the question isn't appropriate, if it's not radical, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't ask that question. It's just kind of like you're being told it's probably not a question you should be asking. But the idea here is that if a question is sufficiently meaningful and it's something of sufficient import to you, then whatever question that is, whether it's on the level of where is my missing handbag, or will we win this war, or will my gran live another year, or whatever the question, on whatever level it's asked, if that question is sufficiently pressing and urgent and you have a genuine need for it, then the chart will turn up to be radical using those traditional considerations before judgment, and it's a question you should be able to answer and achieve a relevant answer from. Anyway, with that aside, the next chart is a horary chart. And this is a question I asked on the 23rd of January this year, 2020, when the news started coming out of Wuhan about the coronavirus. And the question I asked was medicines versus coronavirus, as in what medicines could I use and should I worry about it? So I'm going to put the chart on the screen here. First of all, we've got Gemini rising on the eastern horizon, and Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and you can see Mercury at the top of the chart conjunct the midheaven. So Mercury in this chart, the ascendant, because I'm asking the question, the ascendant and Mercury represents me, and it also, because I'm asking should I worry and what medicines should I use, but what medicines could be used against it in general, and I'm asking on behalf of my country in a sense. So Mercury is specifically me, but it could also represent the UK, because I live in London. The second planet of particular interest in any horary chart is the moon, because the moon represents the general flow of events, and the moon in this chart is in Capricorn in the 8th house. And the third bit of this chart that's particularly relevant is, because I'm asking about this illness, this coronavirus is the 6th house of illness, which has Scorpio on the cusp, and its ruler Mars, which is in Sagittarius, approaching the cusp of the 7th house. So the most relevant things in this chart is I notice immediately that Mars is approaching the 7th angle. It's going to oppose the ascendant, the rising sign, which represents me and my country. That's not good news. It means that the illness is prominent, and it's going to affect me and or the country when it reaches the horizon there in the direction. It's moving around the zodiac in an anti-clockwise direction. It's moving around the sky as the Earth revolves in the opposite direction, but by the zodiacal direction, by its movement through the sky, it's moving towards the western horizon in this chart. Mercury, you can see at the top of the chart at 11 degrees 31 of Aquarius, is applying, because it's moving forward through the zodiac in an anti-clockwise direction by a sextile, a 60-degree aspect towards that Mars. So you can see me and or the people of the country moving towards the disease. A sextile is an easy aspect. That doesn't necessarily mean the result will be pleasant. It just means it's happening naturally and easily. And Mars in Sagittarius is the detriment of Mercury. So it means this disease is potentially harmful to me and or the country. There are several other things in this chart that are of note. The cusp of the 6th house, the beginning of the 6th house with Scorpio on it, it's 0 degrees Scorpio. Scorpio traditionally is a fixed sign, implying that this disease is potentially of long duration or quite difficult to shake, and it's 0 degrees, which implies this is an early stage. It's an early stage of this disease, if you like. So that's potentially a bit dodgy. Mars, its ruler, isn't particularly strong in Sagittarius where it is, but it's very, very hot. It's very fiery. It's very inflammatory. Mars is inflammatory. It causes fevers, infections, and inflammation. It's in a fire sign, which would amplify that tendency. And as I said before, Sagittarius is a double-bodied and a double-bodied sign, and it would imply that it's a disease which there be more than one variant of it, or it may mutate over time, or that you may get more than one hit of disease. And in fact, I think in this chart, what I interpreted it was that Mars is coming to oppose the ascendant Mars is at 13 degrees of Sagittarius, 1337, and it's moving towards the descendant to oppose the ascendant at 1818 of Sagittarius, so that it's got to move however many degrees that is, 4 degrees and 41 minutes. Now, Sagittarius is a sign which implies a medium unit of time. So it's about 4 degrees and 41 medium units. So that could possibly be about 4 to 5 weeks from the time of the question. So I thought in about 5 weeks from the 23rd of January, the virus might hit the UK and begin to cause problems. And also I might get sick around that time from either this disease or something else. And then Mercury, which is the main significator of me and also the people in the UK generally, I'm asking this question for me particularly, but it applies to the people of the UK, Mercury has to move however many degrees. I've got it written down somewhere here. It's my notes, pardon me. So Mercury has to move 3 degrees and 12 minutes. Now, Mercury is in Aquarius, which is a fixed sign. So that implies a longer unit of time. So this might be, rather than weeks, we might be looking at months. 3 months and 12 minutes. So that would be just over 3 months. So we might be looking at January, February, March, April. So towards the end of April or beginning of May. I'm filming this on the 17th of April. Not sick yet, but I judged that I might get sick or around the beginning of May, when Mars in the sky, which will be in late Aquarius at the time, squares, which forms a difficult aspect to Mercury, which rules me and the people of the country in the sky at the beginning of May. So I personally may get sick from corona then. In regard to the first movement of Mars towards the descendant, of course the corona did arrive in the UK, or the first major cases were spotted at the end of February, beginning of March. So it was here by the middle of February. In fact, I got sick with a severe sort of diarrhea, horrible illness around the middle of March. I was very sick for a week, and my lungs have felt tight ever since then for a few weeks. I'm not sure whether that's corona or simple hysteria, but it's interesting that I had one bout and I'm expecting a second, more explicitly coronary thing at the beginning of May. Of course, I'm doing all the hand washing, I'm doing all the usual, self social distancing and all of that, but we'll see. So I also use this chart to help me select herbs. So you've seen in a previous video, the last video I did, which was coming from a more conventional scientific angle about what herbs you could use to help protect against corona, I used this chart to help me select those herbs. I already had a short list of herbs and suggestions from the sort of traditional use and from scientific literature, but I particularly focused on herbs which are ruled by the planet Mercury traditionally, because Mercury is the ascendant ruler in this chart, so it would be expected to strengthen the person, me, and or the people of the country. I also focused on herbs of Venus because Venus is the opponent of Mars. Venus will neutralize Mars. So some of the herbs I mentioned in the last video, for example, elderberry is a Venus herb, mulberries, elecampane, white horehound, licorice, those are all Mercury herbs. So I mainly focused on herbs of Venus and Mercury. And you can also use herbs of the sun because it's a daytime chart. Herb of the sun I mentioned in the last video would be echinacea. So I used it to help the herb selection, and you can also see from this chart that the nature of the illness is primarily, from a traditional point of view, fiery or choleric. That's not only because the disease itself is ruled by Mars in a fire sign on an angle, very hot, but I also use a technique which I won't go into here because it's long, but it came out as herbs of Mars, as the disease is ruled by Mars and is fiery and choleric. So you want herbs that help expel heat. So of the herbs I've mentioned, traditionally, it came up primarily as cholera and secondarily as phlegm, which is interesting. So the disease, if you put that into modern English, the disease is primarily one causing inflammation, which is choler, heat and dryness, but secondarily of its opposite, cold and moisture, phlegm, which of course causes water and congestion. So that's the difficulty breathing, the wet sort of element in the lungs, I would imagine. So, but you mainly want to use herbs that are therefore that expel both choler and phlegm. So a lot of those herbs I mentioned do. Mulberry is cool and moist, so it's mainly good for opposing choler or inflammation. Elderberry expels traditionally both phlegm primarily and choler, so that's very useful. Elecampane is a hot dry herb, so it mainly expels phlegm from the lungs. Horehound, hot dry, mainly expels phlegm, also expels choler. What other herbs did I mention? Licorice is neutral and slightly moistening, so that's better for choler, but it's not a problem for phlegm. More for choler though, for expelling inflammation, for getting down inflammation. And the other herb that I mentioned, elecampane, is a herb of Saturn, which in this chart is a bit ambivalent because Saturn is strong in Capricorn, but rules the 10th house of medicine, which implies medicine of Saturn could be useful because it's nice and strong, but Saturn also rules the 8th house of death. So it can mean that some forms of medicine cause suffering. So I only suggested one herb of Saturn, which is Mundane, and that's because it's very gentle and very traditionally used for chronic lingering coughs. Anyway, so that was that horary chart. So I used the horary to predict when the corona would arrive in the UK, when it might affect me, and when it might have its peak effect in the UK, which I estimate would be around the end of April, beginning of May, particularly towards the beginning of May when there's a Mercury-Mars square in the sky, and I'll put on the screen when that aspect is exact, and also what kind of plants I might use to help, what category of plants and what kind of actions they should have. And then the last bit of astrology I did was I looked at some charts for the UK in general. And these charts, I looked at the Ingress charts, the solstice charts. So I didn't bother looking at the solstices for like Libra autumn last year, 2019, or winter last year, like I did for Wuhan, because it wasn't in the UK then. I instead started by looking at the spring equinox or ingress chart for 2020, which is of course the chart for the 20th of March 2020 for London, the capital of the UK, and I'll pop that on the screen. And in this chart you can see 24 Capricorn rising with Jupiter and Pluto on the ascendant. Jupiter's at 22 Capricorn, Pluto's at 24, and Mars is just above the ascendant at 22 degrees, and Capricorn is Saturn rather is just below it at 29 degrees. So this is a very interesting configuration. These two malefics, Mars and Saturn, the traditional more challenging planets, are straddling the ascendant like that. That in traditional astrology was called besiegement. When the people of the country are literally besieged, I can think of no better signification for a lockdown situation. Also, the modern planet Pluto, of course, medievals didn't know Pluto existed, they didn't have the telescopes to see it, but in modern astrology Pluto is thought to symbolize challenges to survival and very difficult, the emergence of buried, difficult psychological energies in the collective, if you like, which of course we're seeing in terms of, you know, there's an enormous amount of collective fear, people losing their minds just like over various different positions, conspiracy theories, or, you know, that some people are strongly advocating for the government's position. Some people, you know, people are, it's bringing up all kinds of buried complexes. So that's very, very pertinent to this situation. Jupiter is a helpful protective influence, but as I said earlier in this video, it's considered to be weak in Capricorn. So interpreting this chart, you've got Mars and Saturn straddling the ascendant, very good significator of lockdown because it literally means besiegement. Mars rules the 10th house of the government, and in this chart it's exalted. Mars is very strong in Capricorn, and the people of the country are represented by Saturn and the moon, and Saturn in Capricorn and Mars do get on, so it's kind of like the people and the government are united in their desire to do something about this, and in the sort of lockdown in general. However, of course, well, not of course, if you're not an astrologer you may not know this, but the moon, which represents the public mood, doesn't like Capricorn, so it's kind of like the actions that the people are being forced to take, or that are agreeing to, the lockdown, the Saturn rising, and the government's initiative to do that are kind of hurtful to the people, but you know, we're accepting it. The moon is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn and Mars get on very well in Capricorn. So the government, Mars, is it's in Capricorn, it's ruled by Saturn, its main priority is the people, and the people are exalting the government. They are they're in a what's called a mutual reception there. So people are in support of this lockdown. Hang on, alarm going off. We've also got Jupiter rising, which means that even though it's a lockdown, people are going to be okay, because Jupiter's a protective influence. But Jupiter rules the second house in this chart, which has Pisces on the cusp. Traditionally, Jupiter rules Pisces. Jupiter's weak in Capricorn, and it's on the ascendant. What the second house references in traditional astrology is the provisions of the country, its money and its food. So here we have a situation where Jupiter is weak, the money and food are weak, it's weighing on the mind of the people. So people are trapped in their houses and are having issues, are worried about a lack of food and a lack of money, which is obviously very true. So what else have we got? The interesting thing about this chart is that the sixth house of disease, we have one of the eclipse points, the north node in the sixth house, and Gemini on the cusp of the sixth. And Gemini is ruled by Mercury, which is in Pisces. Now, the interesting thing about these things, firstly, the north node in the sixth house is traditionally an indication that the disease is not that serious. Now, this doesn't mean that corona can't be serious. It just means that at this stage, in this quarter, first quarter of the year, from March, April, May, June, the disease is not that, on a national scale, not that intense. And Mercury, the ruler of the sixth, being in Pisces, Pisces is its detriment and fall. In this chart, Saturn, the people of the country, is much stronger than Mercury. So the majority of people will not get sick. However, Mercury also rules the 8th house, the house of death, with Virgo on the cusp of the 8th. So what that means is that this disease is potentially deadly, but on a national level in this first quarter of the year, it's not going to affect that many people. But remember, from the horary I did earlier, I think it's going to sort of peak around sort of May, beginning of May, this country will see. We've also got from this chart, we can see that prices will rise because Mars and Saturn are angular and they cause scarcity of goods. So that could cause some very high prices, particularly I would think with the problems with food and money indicated by that weak Jupiter. I could go on. I've done charts for the rest of the year. I'll just do the chart for the next quarter, the next two actually, because the traditional rule was when you have a chart of the spring equinox, of the sun in the first degree of Aries in the tropical zodiac, if the ascendant sign is what was known traditionally as a movable sign, you needed to do a chart for each following equinox, for all of the 4 equinoxes. If the sign was a double-bodied sign, like Sagittarius or Pisces or Gemini or Virgo, if the sign on the eastern horizon was double-bodied, then you'd only need to do a chart for 2 equinoxes, the spring and the autumn. And if it was a fixed sign, like Scorpio or Leo or Aquarius or Taurus, then you only needed to do the 1 chart for the whole year. This is a movable sign. Capricorn is traditionally a movable sign that's on the eastern horizon, so you need to do a chart for each equinox. That means the situation this year will change in each quarter, potentially. So the next chart, the chart of the summer solstice, the chart for the 20th of June, in London, UK, has the same degree exactly rising with Pluto on the ascendant. So the situation, that's immediately saying the situation is pretty much the same, with the same fears and the same atmosphere. But what's different is that Saturn has moved into the next sign of Aquarius. So it's out of the ascendant, and it's also retrograde. I think that means that over the summer, the lockdown will be eased. And I think the reason for that is that we've got Mars, the ruler of the 10th house, Scorpio, still in the second sign in Pisces, and we have the ruler of the second sign, Jupiter, still in Capricorn. So the money situation is still difficult, but the government's focus has shifted from the people to the money. And Mars in Pisces is traditional astrology is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter in Capricorn, traditionally that was the exaltation of Mars. So you have a very strong mutually supportive aspect between that weak Jupiter representing the money and goods and food of the people, and the government, Mars, which is really focused on that. So I think the government will be spending a lot of money and effort and its focus on the slightly knackered economy and on trying to boost that. It'll be putting money and effort into trying to boost the economy. Its focus has shifted from locking down and protecting the people into supporting that weak economy. The only thing is the fact that Saturn is retrograde in the ascendant suggests that while the lockdown may have been eased, that may not be a permanent situation. The disease itself is Mercury in Cancer. Interestingly, another phlegmy sign, another water sign in the 6th house. So it looks to me as if the disease might even be a little bit stronger than it was before. So my battery's on 5%, so hopefully my camera won't die. But it's generally the lockdown is eased this summer. The interesting thing is that the moon is right on the edge of the 6th house at 25 degrees, applying very closely to a square of Mars. That to me indicates, amongst other things, that particularly towards the end of this quarter, as the beginning of autumn approaches, there may be more inflammatory illness. There may be more disruption caused by illness. So while the lockdown may be eased over summer and the situation may be easier towards the end of the quarter, there may be more discussions or there may be more issues with inflammatory problems, and particularly I think the moon ruling the 7th house of foreigners, there will be lots of controversy over foreigners being employed to work and earn money in some way, which you can already kind of see the beginnings of at this stage in April, but we'll see, whatever. And then the last chart, the next chart I looked at was for the Libra Ingress this year for the autumn solstice. This one, the situation's changed completely. We have a different rising degree, but we have the south node in the ascendant, which is a difficult point, indicates loss or problems. Again, I don't think we're in lockdown still, because Saturn is back in Capricorn, but it's a different ascendant sign this time. So we're still not in lockdown, but Saturn is still retrograde, and it's right on the edge of the 2nd house of money. And we have Mercury, the ruler of the disease, right on the midheaven, the ruler of the 6th house. So the disease is weighing on the government's mind, and I think and it's also being opposed by Mars, which is squaring Saturn. That's called a T-square. We have this combination of Mars and Saturn, the difficult planets, and Mercury ruling the disease. So I think what this chart indicates is there may be, in this autumn quarter from sort of October, November, December, we're looking at potentially an increased incidence of illness again gradually as it goes on. The people being a bit weak and afflicted. Although the government may have some good luck in dealing with the illness in some way, because that Mercury, which rules the illness on the cusp of the 10th house, which represents the government, is conjunct Spica, this very fortunate star at 23-24 Libra. So I think what this means, I've written down my interpretation for the chart as a whole, because this Mars on the fourth cusp represents land, property, and also the opposition party to the government. So that's the 4th house with Mars there, this sort of attacking inflammatory planet that's very strong there, but one of the problem planets, squaring Saturn, which represents restriction and limitation and debts and problems. And because Saturn's retrograde, it's returning problems or problems with boundaries on the cusp of the house of money and goods and food. And then both of those are in a tense aspect to Mercury, which rules the 6th house of employees and sickness, the 7th house of foreigners, and the 9th house of overseas and long distance travel. So this was my interpretation of this final quarter of the year, of the calendar year, from sort of October, November, December 2020 in the UK. So as the quarter goes on, probably increasing sickness because of the angularity of the rule of the 6th house. The people are weak and afflicted. That is because there's the south node rising and the ruler of the ascendant, Jupiter, is in Capricorn, so it's weak. There may be increasing disease transmission towards the end of the year, and the issue of travel is important. The sort of, well, that's not a surprise. Increasing debt and problems with housing. That's because of that Mars on the 4th. So there's a problem with people not having the money to sustain the housing market. So there might be a problem with the housing market crashing or something like that. Crisis with hospital beds. I think this is when the hospital beds issue in the last quarter of the year may be more apparent. Either if the coronavirus resurges, or this will be when that issue becomes most discussed. I don't know. The reason I say that is because we have the moon ruling the 8th house of death in the 12th house of hospitals, conjunct this star at 10 degrees Sagittarius called Antares, which is the heart of the Scorpion. It's in the constellation of Scorpio, not the sign, but the constellation of Scorpio. And that usually implies problems, inflammatory problems, and anger over that. What else to say? Yeah, and the government, which is the 10th house, is ruled by Venus, which is in the 8th house of death, in a friendly aspect to that moon. So I think what that means is There is going to be a crisis with beds in hospitals, leading perhaps to people dying, and the government's very preoccupied by this and trying to sort it out and give some help for that issue. The government acts to protect people with the illness. The government is receiving good technical advice. That's the Mercury conjunct Speaker on the midheaven, particularly from people overseas and from higher education and whatever, and from medical people. That's the 9th house of higher education and educated people, the 6th house of disease, the 7th house of other people, so that the government is getting good advice about the disease, and there may be some positive technical research-based developments into the disease, but Mercury is squaring that Saturn and opposing that Mars, so probably there's going to be some frustration and some blocks in getting any actual positive developments. So what have I said here? So good technical advice, but there may be big disputes owing to financial problems and debts. The government may be in crisis over debts. There will be some aid from foreign powers, particularly with the issue of debt. We've got the Sun in Libra in the 9th house and Venus ruling the government in Leo in the 8th house. So Venus is in a sign ruled by the Sun is in the sign ruled by Venus, and there's an 8th, 9th crossover there, which means that the government, in sort of worrying about debts, may be being supported by bosses or important people from overseas. So that could be, I don't know, big bosses of companies or prime ministers or whatever of overseas, but also again technical advice from important people, important knowledgeable people. I don't know. Anyway, so the government crisis over debts, aid from foreign powers, strong attacks from the opposition versus the government. I think Labour are going to be really belabouring the government over their over the financial situation and over their handling of the epidemic, of the pandemic. Strong attacks from the opposition against the government lockdown policy on the disease and its debt generating effects, or they may be angry about there not being a lockdown. I don't know, but there'll be lots of strong, really marked opposition, and I say problems with the finances and with the housing market, I think. And then much frustration and argumentation about financial effects of lockdown, food, money, and provisions issues. So that's the last quarter of the year, and then in winter, by the Capricorn Ingress, I'm not going to say much about this chart. It's not a terrible chart, the winter chart, but Saturn is again on the ascendant. We've got 1 degree of Aquarius rising and Saturn exactly rising. So I think in winter, as in December, January, February 2020, 2021, we're going to be back in lockdown. However, this time, Jupiter's also in the ascendant, but not in Capricorn. It's in Aquarius. It's a bit stronger. And we've also got Venus in the midheaven. Venus does rule the 8th house of death in this chart. So that means, again, that death is going to be something of an issue. But I think even though we might be back in lockdown, it won't be quite as critical as now. Anyway, this has been a super long video. Thank you so much for sitting through it. If you have done, if you like this kind of thing, please like this video. Please do share it with anyone you think might be interested. Please subscribe, and thank you for watching it, and maybe see you in the next one. All right, bye.